So according to my clock, we are at the top of the hour, and that means I have the privilege of introducing our next keynote speaker. So here I have Marty Seymour, and Marty is Director of Industry and Stakeholder Relations with Farm Credit Canada, FCC. So as we heard in the previous session, the Barton Report put agriculture in the spotlight as a sector where Canada has the potential to become the trusted global leader in safe, nutritious, and sustainable food in the 21st century. And now, as we face a global pandemic, agriculture is once again in the spotlight as an essential service, providing food, fuel, and fiber. So Marty's here with us today to talk about lessons learned, new ideas, and future opportunities from 2020 within the Canadian agricultural industry. And Marty is going to challenge us. How can we think bigger as an industry? What does the future hold for us? So without further ado, I will hand the controls over to Marty. Again, you can ask questions through the chat box and Q&A at any time. And just to note that we would sincerely love to thank FCC for supporting and sponsoring AgX as well as this session with Marty. So Marty, take it away.
All right, thank you, Heather. It's great to be here today, guys. I guess here for me happens to be in Regina, so it's maybe not as romantic and glamorous as the old days when we went to conferences. What I have today, Heather's right. I want to stretch our brains today and get us to think a little bit bigger and challenge some of the convention that we have in our industry. And I think to do this, I want to start with a story. And I don't know if you guys follow rodeo, but I'm a Westerner and I follow rodeo a lot. And this week is the NFR in Arlington, Texas. And I started to think about the evolution of tie-down roping. And in the 40s, maybe the 50s, a guy named Willard Porter wrote a book called 13 Seconds. And at that time, he tied a calf in 13 seconds and he couldn't believe how fast that was. He said that time would never be broke. And you know, if you don't know much about rodeo, back in that era, say 40s, 50s, 60s, when rodeo was just kind of a hobby we did on the weekends, horses were big. They were big lumber wagons and they would run calves for 200 yards and catch them and wrestle them down. They were big and strong and wrangly. And so 13 seconds was quite an accomplishment. And if you fast forward into the 70s, we're still not exactly sure, but it could be Blair Burke's dad, Mr. Burke or Buddy Burke. He might have been the first guy to get off the right-hand side of a horse. And so he reinvented the sport. Conventionally before that, we always got off the left-hand side in rodeo, and he got off on the right-hand side. I'm like, oh my God, he's totally reinvented this sport. And we went from 13 to 12 and 11. And then in the 80s, a guy named Roy Cooper comes along. And in that early 80s, this is when rodeo was shifting from, it wasn't just Budweiser beer and honky tonks. It was starting to become a real thing, a job. And so the sport of rodeo had to professionalize itself. And so we started to get more technical and look for nuances and edges to be faster. Roy comes along, jumps off the right-hand side of his horse and he holds his slack, which if you're a technical person in rodeo, is just a nuance on how to manage his rope to be faster. So fast forward to that, we get into the 90s and along comes poly ropes. And before that, ropes were made of grass, but we changed the technology in ropes so that they were more weather resistant and had more lifespan to them. Turn of the century, 2000s, all of a sudden we realized, you know, that technology we had in ropes, maybe it's slowing us down. Let's go back to the original grass ropes. 2010-ish, plus or minus a year, the Calgary Stampede says, hey guys, tie-down roping has an image issue. And to keep this sport relevant and keep the sponsors and the fans coming, we need to modify the rules because our customer says, this isn't a flattering sport the way you've got it structured. So they changed some fundamental rules. Calves no longer had to lay down for 6 seconds after they were tied. If a cowboy was to knock a calf off its feet, that would be a disqualification. And it brought rodeo up again another level. By 2010, we were tying calves in 6.3 seconds at the Vegas finals. And if you think back to where my story started in 1940, it was 13 seconds. We said we could never be faster. By the time the Calgary Stampede changed the rules, we are half as long. We're just over 6 seconds in order to do this sport. And I share this because the parallel for me is in farming. So if I think back to grain farming and the mechanization of grain farming in the 50s, 60s, It allows us to scale. It was really the changing of the family farm. All of a sudden, we didn't need as many farmers because we had tractors and we could cover more ground. And then you get into the late 70s, crop protection tools became more prominent, more farmers were using them. And then you get into the zero-till era in the West in the late 80s. We start to really reinvent, kind of like the calf roper that got off the other side of the horse. We're going to just redo this sport. GMOs come along, once again, another change. And if you think about in the last 5 years, conversations around sustainability and regenerative ag is just like the Calgary Stampede, an external force looking into our industry saying, hey, how could agriculture do better? And no longer were like the cowboys of the era that didn't want the change in the rules because that's how it's always done. It took an external force to change. And I see some of that pressure being applied to agriculture. So that's grain farming. You take the beef side, we had the British breeds of the 50s and 60s, and then we brought along the continental breeds, the Simmental and the Charolais came in from Europe in the late 70s. And then pretty soon we were crossbreeding. And then we realized, hey, we actually have some carcass opportunities to change. And if I take it to the most recent space we're in the last 3 to 5 years, external forces in the form of welfare and how we manage animals is driving the conversation. Once again, talking about sustainability, animal welfare, those things. So just like the journey of the cowboy, so has been the journey of agriculture. So for me, I want to introduce to you guys 3 things today. Really, I want to talk about diversity of thought. I want to talk about opportunities in sustainability and opportunities in automation to live into what Heather said around this challenge that the Barton Report gave to Canadians to say we could do more to live into our potential. So for me, diversity of thought is really kind of starts at an anchor. We need a vision for Canadian agriculture. I honestly think we could do better in this space, that we might be lacking vision. And it's mostly because we're a very compartmentalized industry. So this summer, when my life changed to where I was working from home and not traveling the conference circuit, I started to see the compartmentalization more clearly. Is the issues of the day to carry us through COVID was kind of a crisis management mode, but also business as usual issues. And if you think about our industry, business risk management was top of mind all summer, and how do we enhance agri-stability? I look at the conversations in supply management and compensation as it's related to trade deals. A very deep conversation about temporary foreign workers and labor. Outside of that, you've got African swine flu and how do we address animal health issues in our industry. On top of that, in the middle of all of this COVID is the food processing industry that wasn't part of some of those production conversations, but clearly mattered as we started to see breakdowns in plant speeds in terms of cattle processing, or in the vegetable industry, slowdowns in our ability to make sure we're getting canned goods out the door. And we did surprisingly well through all this period, but the compartmentalization made me think about maybe we're lacking vision in this industry. Overlay that to this other change I experienced through the summer. We started to meet remotely, much like we're doing today. And the advantage of this is we can get to more people. But about a week ago, the Beef Value Roundtable met, and it was really cemented this idea for me that what was missing. And for me, the in-person meetings, this roundtable used to meet once a year, and there'd be 30 or 40 of us sit around a table in a rather orchestrated format. And then at the breaks, we'd go and have coffee and et cetera. This year, instead of 30 people, we had 88 people sign into the meeting, and we were celebrating this. And it struck me that I'm not convinced we advanced issues in the sector. And we spent 6 hours in that daily meeting going through presentations and being informed and updated, and I valued that. But what I realized was we weren't having the water cooler conversations and the conversation, the buffet line and over dinner, which is where the hard conversations happen in our industry. And so I think about a gap that COVID's created as we've been ambitious to digitize our world here and do these remote things, is we're missing some of this nuance and how do we solve real problems in our industry? Because frankly, mediocre isn't going to cut it for Canadian agriculture moving forward. I think we have a high cost model in Canada in general, and it's anchored in, we have a short growing season, construction season short, and it drives added cost into the model. We have huge geography. If you think about how far we have to move food to get it to market, our labor's just as spread out in this country. So to me, we can't stay at the level of thinking we were before. That's where diversity of thought interests me. And I don't think it's the government's job to drive vision for our industry. I actually like the idea that we in agriculture, you and me on this call, are a big part of that. And we need to collectively share a common vision. And I have a bias. I'm from Saskatchewan. My family are still in the cows and canola business. And I think about what I've learned traveling the world. Some of the work I've done at FCC is that we can be a world-class protein provider. I don't think Canada's going to win the race to the cheapest starch. We don't have a long enough growing season to compete with the Midwest US. Our corn yields are great, but they're still not that level. South America is running 2 crops a year. There's other places can grow rice better. So from a starch standpoint, I'm quite happy to sit on the sidelines, but I want to be a world-class protein provider. Our climate alone, the diversity in terms of plant and animal agriculture here, make that a really attainable goal for me. Overlay that with great trading status and a good brand image for this country, I think we could be a world-class protein provider. But it's going to take diversity of thought. So if I had to kind of wrap up this area on diversity of thought, I think we could start with driving more young people, and probably many of you on this call would be my example, to participate in our boards and our committees in our industry. And I just love diversity of thought in terms of starting with age. And the Minister's Youth Advisory Council is a great example of reaching outside of our echo chamber to get new thinking, to say, hey, are we solving these problems with the next level thinking? I do it on the personal side. And if you're looking for a takeaway from this talk, is create your own personal board of directors. A group of like-minded people that share, a passion for things you do, but aren't necessarily subject matter experts in what you are. And socialize your ideas with them to try to raise your game and think things through from different angles. I watch news media from all feeds to make sure that I'm still achieving diversity of thought. So think about a couple action steps in there and maybe how that might apply to you. All right, I want to move on to chapter 2 here, sustainability. I think right now we've got a bit of a reprieve from the pressures on sustainability, but when the COVID crisis management starts to soften and companies and consumers and society gets back to normal, they are going to come talking to agriculture about environmental sustainability. I don't think this has gone away. I think it's just been tempered through the COVID period. So for me, there's a conversation that I hear all the time is, hey, we want to get paid for doing these sustainable practices or these extra things we do. I'm not just convinced that's going to happen. And I've lived some of that through my beef work at Agribition when we were looking at traceability and ear tags. So there's lots of examples of this, but places like the EU, some domestic markets are saying, hey, we want you to be living into some sustainability protocols or expectations. And it's not so much about extracting a premium, it's about being able to have multiple markets to go to. That's the sad hard truth of that conversation around sustainability. And I think in our industry, we actually do a really good job, but we have a communication problem. When it comes to sustainability, there would be arguments that we get into this kind of fighting war, and you see this in public trust too, where we would make a statement. I've heard this on a call I was on recently, that going vegan for 1 year is equivalent of 1 flight to Europe in terms of carbon footprint. But when you hear that as a consumer and someone challenges your value, all it does is draw a deeper ditch between the two of you and you trying to suggest that a diet choice isn't as helpful as doing other things in their life. The honest answer is all you do is build a bigger wall. I think as an industry, our approach to this can be to adopt language of continuous improvement. And why I come to that is I think about the medical community, and my doctor graduated med school in 1978. I have an expectation that he's continued his education for the last 30 years so that when he shows up to provide me medical care, that he's actually has the latest technology. I honestly believe that the food retail and the consumers that I talk to would be very happy to know that our industry is adopting continuous improvement philosophy, that we don't have to have it perfect. We have lots of grace in our ability to be imperfect by the consumer, but to lean on the stuff we've done before and say that's good enough isn't what the consumer of the future is looking for. So coming out of COVID, I think we're gonna have more robust conversations in the supply chain about what does sustainability look like, in particular environmental sustainability, and how can ag play into that. The one thing I would encourage you coming out of this call is every time you have an opportunity to make a statement, is let people know that agriculture is part of a solution to climate change. And I think lots of you on the call would be feeling the ickiness leading up to this is we always feel like we're getting blamed for climate change. And we saw in the Prime Minister's throne speech this fall a signal that he sees agriculture as part of a solution to climate change. And that's a great message. But I think industry needs to step up and make sure that we're living into it with attitudes of continuous improvement and reminding consumers and everybody connected to the industry that we're part of a solution to climate change. All right, point number 3, and my last chapter I want to talk about before we get into some questions is automation. I think we need an automation strategy in this country, and COVID helped bring that to light for me too. And a couple reasons. One is the breakdowns and the stress that we saw in the food system in terms of processing lines and making sure food was on the shelves. But also, if we're going to grow the industry and we're going to reach international markets, is we have a scalability problem. Because we can't scale if we don't address some of these things around automation. So for me, automation has 2 moving parts. One is labor, and the other one is digitization. So let's talk about labor first. To me, I don't know if labor's on enough agendas. I think at first, with lots of parts of our industry, whether it's dairy, greenhouses, cattle, or canola, we're all kind of around the edges talking about labor. But I think it's been such a problem for our industry to fill the job gap that we just kind of think that's business as usual. I think we could amp that up by having more meaningful conversations about what is the labor gap we're after. And the one that I've identified is a skills gap. So when I think automation, my first run is, well, that's robots and AI. I want you to shift your thoughts, because I think that's the easy part. I think we can do that. The technology is getting cheaper. We can figure out return on investment, put it into play. But it's the skills gap that might be slowing us down in adoption or the return on investment of those things. And I think about electricians as a best example. So if we're going to run a food processing plant, we need an electrician. And maybe you don't think of that, but if you have a mid-sized meat processing plant, you're canning vegetables, clearly there's a whole electrical environment inside the processing plant. Well, today I would need a 4-year journeyman ticket in order to do my electrical work in the plant. But that ticket includes knowledge about putting a ceiling fan in your house or working on 3-phase power and a motor in the oil patch. I think we could be well served to create a streamlined training program for skills like electricians, where I just need to know the specific requirements to work in the plant, and maybe a little bit broader than that about the principles of 3-phase power and how to work a circuit board inside a particular computing device, versus these long drawn out education models. And so there's an opportunity inside of that. I think we have a branding issue in our industry, attracting people, accountants, lawyers, marketers, agronomists, getting people excited about the opportunity in our industry, because I really do think there is a lot of opportunity in Canadian agriculture. Yeah, maybe I'll switch to digitization based on that. So let's talk about, we've got skill development over there as part of importance around automation, but digitization. And this really starts, for those of you on the line that are farming, is digitizing your records. And FCC, some of our work would say about half of records are captured in a digital format in farms. And lots of records are on a notepad in a filing cabinet. That's not unlike the entire supply chain. There's lots of trucking and shipping records that are still paper-based systems. I think we need to digitize the whole chain in order to once again find efficiencies. What worries me a little bit about the digitization conversation is we in our industry have talked about broadband and how broadband gets in the way. And there will be those of you listening on this call having an interrupted feed and some annoyance in terms of your experience on the digital world. I want to caution us in our industry that broadband doesn't solve the real problem we have. Broadband's like applying a pipe, an irrigation pipe, a 10-inch pipe to a particular property and getting to the end of the pipe and then have nothing to water. And so my challenge to us is the people on this call that maybe are developing technology or looking at software tools is that you're developing, or we are developing as an industry, things that help me make decisions. And there's lots of gadgets and widgets that I can get access to that broadband will make easier. But if I think about last fall on the combine, I realized most of what I was really looking for was ways to make sense of my data. Variable rate fertilizing was probably an early part of that, how to truly look at data deeper. But we need more of that. We need more companies need to come into our sector with solutions to problems, not just gadgets that appear to make my life easier. So lastly, I believe that the economic recovery is going to be green, that all the federal programming and support and the ambition will be around things that also achieve some of our environmental sustainability goals as a country. And so if you have projects that fit into that, I think you're going to see those adopted early and first in terms of governments at all on that front. But there's opportunity inside that. And so COVID taught me a couple things. Is we do have a resilient food system. We certainly had pressure, and we had some dark days trying to make sure that we could have a home for our hogs, or that we were going to get food delivered on time to places. But for the most part, the Canadian food system did an outstanding job. And those of you that are involved on the call should have a sense of pride about that. But I do believe we need a vision. My vision, to kind of clear the blank stage, is we should be a world-class protein provider in all categories of plant and animal. Is we should be best in class because we can. So to get there and to be best in class in protein, I think it comes down to these three things we just talked about. One is diversity of thought. We need to attract people into the industry that think and do and behave different than we do. We need to really look seriously at sustainability and embrace the idea of continuous improvement. And then automation really is anchored in skill development for our country and digitization of our records. So thank you. And I'll turn it back over to Heather. If you want to try to manage some questions, I don't know how you'd like to go about it. So stage is yours, Heather.
Sure. We could share our stage. Okay, we've got a question from George here. Do you think that we could invest more into encouraging innovations?
That's a really good question, George. I have some experience with that in a couple ways, one professionally and one personally. So professionally at FCC, we've actually done more investment in venture capital partnerships in the last year than we had done probably 10 years private. We've always had a venture arm of our company that few people would be familiar with. It was a relationship we had with an external called Avrio. And in the last year, we've invested in a fund in Ontario, a couple in Calgary. And so I think investment attraction is part of it. I do worry as an industry that maybe our appetite for risk in agriculture is a bit lower. It might just be the DNA of our industry. But if you were talking venture cap money in California and going after just generic consumer goods, they throw money at stuff like it's a contest with lots of risk premium. And in Canada, we tend to be a little more conservative. On the personal side, I sit on a board in Saskatchewan called Innovation Sask, and we would support and fund early stage startups. And so I'm seeing what's in the pipeline. I really like some of these companies, but I think Canada could do better. I'm starting to feel that the money's there, but not necessarily at the angel level, but more at that, you just kind of have a proven technology. Now we're ready to fund you. And so probably the real financing gaps at angel investing, which is high risk stuff. Okay,
great. And feel free to ask lots and lots more questions. I think I wrote about a dozen while you were speaking there, Marty. Lots and lots of food for thought. I was wondering, and we were actually just talking about this over kind of a pseudo lunch here, but in terms of diversity of thought and in terms of, not having so much diversity in terms of heads butting, but really being able to move forward on ag policy. Like, do you think that we worry too much about saying the right thing or being politically correct and avoid talking about the real problems and getting to the real solutions? And how can we better drive ag policy? I just actually completed a policy fellowship at University of Guelph. And although it was extremely enlightening and a great program in many, many ways, I'm not sure I know how to have more success in influencing ag policy. So maybe, I see a big role for ag policy. Of course, the farmers need to be on the same page too, but at the end of the day, there's somebody there making decisions on our behalf. Any comments?
Yeah, that is a hard question. Not because of the way you framed it, but because we've been trying to collaborate in agriculture since the dawn of time. Like since we had farm groups, we're trying to figure out where do we fit. And so I think a couple things. I don't have the answer. If I did, I'd be quietly beavering away trying to help our industry get there. And so what I see though are some moments of wow, we're on the right track. And a crisis will always do that. The cattle industry by design is quite fragmented, regionally, structure-wise. BSE hit the industry in 2003, and everybody went around the table and said, we're all hands on deck. We were selling hamburger in parking lots. We were partnering with packers. Every agency was working together. COVID has some nuances of that too. And I would say, this summer when we were trying to figure out, I say that we as an industry, how we deal with the foreign worker challenge and how do we pull the country together, which for the most part was in Ontario, Quebec and BC, where we're actually using real foreign workers to help manage our vegetable crops, for example, like time-bound things. Everybody got on board on that. But also, I saw the prairies and I saw Eastern Canada saying, hey, we have nuances in there that are important to us too. And labor brought us together. And so I honestly think, as your question is truly complex, is maybe if you didn't figure out in my talk, I'm a huge fan of simplifying complicated things. And that can be dangerous. But I think that's where we get wrapped around the axle as an industry. We add huge amount of complexity and everybody sort of fighting for their own. We need some centralizing issues. Labor might be one. Supply chain resilience, something we all benefit from. I'd start there if I had to create a roadmap. And then back to this, I don't know what our vision should be, but I'll just say it's protein and let's do that and be awesome at that. Now, all our policy, all of our effort starts to drive to that common goal. It's how every private company operates. But our industry, because I think regions and history of sort of fighting for what's best for our constituent, that's the antibody that gets in the way of this. And there's some good people in ag right now. I think I had this question on a coffee row I did yesterday, and they said, what's changed in ag lobby? And I saw this since I probably started paying attention 10 years ago, was more groups showing up with solutions. And I'm watching all three levels of government really respond to that. And I think the days of presenting your problem to government and asking them to solve it are diminishing. I think governments are inundated with problems and are inspired by solutions. So I think if we could do that more, I think, it's a long game. We don't solve this year, but COVID's a great platform to build off of.
Great, wonderful. And we've got some questions pouring in here. I really like this one from Mirna. What would your thoughts be on the right balance producers need in terms of hands-on skills compared to softer skills like innovation, leadership, advocacy, and communications?
Okay, I like that question. My brain ran to, you didn't see me, I wrote a note because I sometimes get so excited about a question like this. I started doing a podcast, FCC Knowledge Podcast, and you can check it out. And I know it's a selfless promotion here coming in this chat, but why I say that is a guy named Ben Campbell and I did a podcast recently, and this guy is super inspiring, young guy, south of Calgary. And he really looked at his labor model and where he spent his time in a unique manner. And I forget his number now, but he said, if I can outsource it for $17 or $19 an hour, I do. And then I do something else. And so I think to that question, I don't have the answer about what the balance should be, but I like the philosophy of saying there's a tripwire for me that says if I can pay someone else to do it for 17, I should, and then I should spend time in other areas. I don't, as far as the second part of that question around the balance of public trust and some of those chapters that she identified, I don't know that I'm thoughtful enough to answer that here on the fly about that balance. But at a minimum, I think if you approached it, if you had a takeaway from here, is listen to Ben and his approach to that, because there's something in that for all of us. I work for a big crown corporation in an office environment and farm on the side. I'm forever taking and making priorities in my day, forever. And so I don't have a formula. It's a bit imperfect, but I have a couple guideposts, the things that get me the most lift, the most altitude, I tend to spend more time on. And once in a while, it's fun to just do stuff that's a distraction. Like Ben will teach you that too, is that once in a while, it's okay not to do something for the economic benefit. There's a quality of life conversation in all of this too. So I like that question. It's a good one.
I love that question. It's a great one. And it kind of got me thinking of something you said before, Marty, talking about the importance of skills development within the context of labor. But something that I was thinking of kind of as I was reading Myrna's question was, there's some things that we can perhaps produce automation for in terms of the technical skills on the farm, for example, and some of the production related pieces, but there's some skills that we haven't quite found the robot for. And I think that's when it comes to that, taking information and being able to make a decision within the context of all the different variables, so that that business management mindset is something that, you can't kind of plug in a robot and say, make this decision for me. So, we've certainly seen in our research that there's a huge correlation between financial performance specifically and lifelong learning. So maybe, maybe thinking about, and I love what you said about, you know, what are the things that I should be doing with the talents I have, as well as with the passions that I have? And what are the things that still need to get done? And what's the best way to do that? And I know for me, like from a personal point of view, I love editing documents, but my board reminds me that's not what you're paid for. So if I want to edit a document, I'm working on a Saturday morning, I'm not working within the confines of my job. So, but I think we come back to this balancing act all the time in agriculture, production, business, customer focus, supplier focus, whatever. It's a
Yeah,
balancing act.
lots of leadership books on this stuff. And so I've been applying it for years, and my personal board dynamic is these people don't agree with me and they're hard on me. But they bring diversity to the problem. And I think that's one element of good leadership. The second one is surrounding yourself with people that have skills that don't. So Heather, if you and I were working together, I would send you all the proofreading documents that you could imagine. And I would ideate, as we just did on this talk, I would come up with big picture vision and concepts and get you to clean it up for me and make it into something workable. And so I think in agriculture, we got to get over this idea that I have to know all the jobs and have to be good at everything, and start to say, you know what, man, I can't think of how many farmers I know that love to fix the tractor and are awful at books. And then they have this guilt. I'm like, give up the guilt, hire that out, fix the tractor. You can do that. Conversely, there's people like Ben Campbell I referenced earlier that likes the book side of things and does that really well and happens to strike balance with working outside the house too. So I think the point of I think this question is to reflect on and say, what's my natural competitive advantage? What's the one thing that I'm good at that no one else is? Do that. That applies to your farm business where you're located. If you want to sell stuff and you say, you know what, I can naturally grow onions, no one else can. Well, then don't grow corn, grow onions. And that applies to your skill sets. It applies to everything you do. And if you just think of it personally and professionally, that's a really good question to drive clarity. Because what I see for most people is cloudiness, not in terms of not understanding the problem, but the problem's so complex that they get tied up in the cloud. Just simplify it. What's your natural competitive advantage?
Nice. I think that makes a lot of sense. And speaking of simplification, we've got a comment here from Wilson Lurie, and I think it's a nice one. It says, "I like your idea of simplifying questions and problems. I learned from a former president of Olds College to think about what you would do if you had to do it tomorrow, i.e., a quick top line approach instead of spending a lot of time on details." And I think that's, we talk about analysis paralysis a lot. And although we do need to be kind of critical when we're planning to do something, at the same time, you do need to be in a position where you can take that leap of faith. Maybe you could comment on, and maybe in the bigger picture of taking opportunities, how can we be mindful of we need to do the right research, but also not miss an opportunity because we've got our head stuck in a book or through Google or something like that.
It's kind of my informal board met this week, and I would say the most profound question that I've heard in 6 months is this one gentleman said he had sat on boards his whole life, and every time he showed up in the room, he said, I always ask the same question: who do I serve, or who do we serve? And I applied that to my personal business. Said, okay, so I'm growing calves this fall, or I'm growing canola. Who do I serve? And I think it's a complicated question that's different. I personally always take myself to the consumer, but I think I have a bias in that choice because of the world I live in. I spend lots of time paying attention to grocery and food retail. But maybe you grow calves and you said, you know what, I grow heifers. And I have a friend who said that to me one day. He says, Marty, I don't sell beef, I sell heifers. And so I serve my heifer client. That clarity of that question will once again takes the cloud away. And I just like it. Write that down. It's got me stuck for the last 3 days thinking about it over and over and over again. And I think it just, it's back to this old professor, is there's simple ways to approach problems. You can add complexity later. If you can get to the simple root of what's keeping you up at night, what your opportunity is, the complexity will come. It's scrubbing that away. That's where the effort needs to be.
Absolutely. And in a world of so much data, you need to figure out how you can scrub away until you get to those golden nuggets and hold on to them with your life.